I secretly saved my dad's business from ruin, using my own money for 2 years. But on my MBA graduation day, Dad chose my nephew's baseball game over me because of my sister's manipulative lies. I left the secret binder on the table, found a hidden note from my late mother, and walked away, forever. Welcome back to Van's Rock Stories. Have you ever spent years helping people, fixing their problems, and showing up whenever they needed you, only to realize they barely noticed? If you've ever felt taken for granted by family, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about family, betrayal, and personal growth. My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 35 years old, and the morning of my MBA graduation should have been one of the happiest mornings of my life. I'd spent 3 years earning that degree while working full-time, late-night assignments, weekend classes, missed vacations, more coffee than I care to admit. And now it was finally graduation day. I was standing in front of the mirror adjusting my gown when Nathan, my fiancé, walked past the bedroom door. "There she is," he said with a smile. I laughed. "Who?" "The woman who somehow survived working full-time and getting an MBA at the same time." "Barely." "Still survived." Nathan had watched every stressful semester from the front row. If anyone understood how hard I'd worked for this moment, it was him. Then my phone rang. Melanie, my younger sister. I smiled when I saw her name. I figured she was calling about parking or asking where to meet us after the ceremony. I answered. "Hey." "Morning." Something about her voice felt off, not upset, not excited, just strangely casual. After a brief pause, she said, "Dad wanted me to call because he's already heading to Tyler's game." I frowned. "What game?" "Tyler's baseball tournament." For a second, I thought I'd heard her wrong. "My graduation is today." "I know." I waited for an explanation, an apology. Anything. Nothing came. I finally said, "Dad told me months ago he'd be there." "Well, Tyler's team made the playoffs." The way she said it made it sound completely reasonable, like that settled everything. I stared out the window. Families were arriving on campus, parents, grandparents, entire groups coming to celebrate someone they were proud of. Meanwhile, I was trying to understand why my own father had changed his mind. "When did he decide this?" I asked. "A few days ago." That hit harder than I expected. Not because he wasn't coming, because he'd known for days and never told me himself. "So he had you call?" "He thought it would be easier." "Easier." Nathan looked up from across the room. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could tell something was wrong. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The excitement I'd felt all morning was fading fast. "Olivia, don't make this a thing," Melanie said. That got my attention. "A thing?" "Tyler's been excited about this all week." I almost laughed. Nobody was asking Tyler to skip his game. Nobody was asking Melanie to miss it. But somehow I was already being treated like the unreasonable one. Then she added, "It's just one ceremony. 3 years of work. One ceremony." I looked down at the tassel in my hand. What hurt wasn't the event itself. It was how easily everyone seemed willing to dismiss it. I took a breath. "Okay. Okay? Yeah." There wasn't much else to say. Then, just before hanging up, Melanie said something that stayed with me for the rest of the morning. "You know how important family is to Dad right now." And then the call ended. I stared at my phone for several seconds, because the more I thought about that sentence, the less sense it made. If family was so important to Dad, why didn't that include me? That question followed me all the way to campus. Nathan drove while I stared out the window. A few times he looked over like he wanted to ask what I was thinking, but he didn't push. I appreciated that. I wasn't even sure how to explain it myself. Part of me was hurt. Part of me was angry. And part of me kept making excuses for Dad. Maybe Tyler's playoff game really mattered. Maybe Melanie had pressured him. Maybe there was something I didn't understand. By the time we arrived, I decided I wasn't going to let any of it ruin my graduation. At least that was the goal. The campus was packed with families, parents carrying flowers, grandparents taking photos, groups of relatives trying to organize everyone for pictures. Everywhere I looked, someone was celebrating. I tried not to compare. I really did. Nathan squeezed my hand. "You okay?" "I'm fine." He gave me a look. The honest answer. I smiled. "I'll survive." "You shouldn't have to survive your graduation day." Before I could answer, a few classmates walked over. The conversation shifted to final projects, job offers, and plans after graduation. For a while, it helped. I laughed, took pictures, talked about the future. For a few minutes, I almost felt normal again. Then one of my classmates asked, "So where's your family sitting?" I hesitated, only for a second. They had another commitment today. Nobody questioned it, but I hated how quickly the answer came out. The ceremony started soon after. I took my seat and focused on the stage. Names were called. Families cheered. Some people stood and waved. Others held up signs and banners. Every few minutes, another graduate would look into the crowd and smile at someone they loved. More than once, I caught myself scanning the audience, not because I expected Dad to show up, just because some habits are hard to break. Nathan was easy to spot. Front section. Big smile. The moment he saw me looking, he gave me a ridiculous thumbs up. I couldn't help laughing. When my name was called, I walked across the stage, shook hands, and accepted my diploma cover. The applause filled the room, and somewhere in the crowd I could hear Nathan cheering louder than anyone else. For a moment, that was enough. After the ceremony, everyone gathered outside. Photos, hugs, congratulations. The whole campus felt alive. I was talking with Nathan when I heard someone call my name. "Olivia." I turned and saw Professor Grant. He'd been one of my favorite professors in the MBA program. He shook my hand. "Congratulations. You earned this." "Thank you." He smiled. "I always tell people you're one of the hardest working students I've taught." That meant a lot coming from him. Then he glanced around. "Where's your family? I'd love to meet them." The question caught me off guard. I forced a smile. "They couldn't make it." His expression softened. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." "It's okay, they're busy." The moment I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. Busy. That sounded better than the truth. After he walked away, Nathan looked at me. "You don't have to defend them." "I'm not." He raised an eyebrow. I laughed quietly. "Okay, maybe I am." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Pictures, congratulations, small conversations. I smiled when people expected me to smile, and by the end of the day, I almost convinced myself everything was fine. Then my phone buzzed that evening. Melanie had posted photos from Tyler's baseball game. I scrolled through them. Tyler, his teammates, parents in the stands. Then I saw Dad. He was smiling from ear to ear with one arm around Tyler's shoulders. Underneath the picture, Melanie had written, "Family comes first. What a great day." I stared at the screen. Then I looked at my graduation photo sitting on the table beside me, and for the first time all day, I stopped looking for excuses. I kept staring at that photo longer than I should have. Family comes first. 3 simple words. The problem was that I couldn't stop comparing them to everything that had happened over the previous 2 years. Not because I wanted to start a fight, because the more I thought about it, the more something felt off. Nathan eventually sat down beside me. "You've been quiet." I handed him my phone. He looked at the picture, then at me, then back at the picture. He didn't say anything right away. "Go ahead," I said. "What?" "Say what you're thinking." Nathan sighed. I don't think this is really about the graduation. I knew he was right. The graduation hurt. But it wasn't the whole story. Not even close. The truth was that everything had started almost 2 years earlier when my mother died. Mom had been the person who held everything together. The family, the business, the schedules, the bills. The details nobody noticed until they stopped getting done. When she passed away from a heart condition, everyone focused on the obvious loss, the grief, the funeral, the empty chair at family dinners. What nobody talked about was everything she had quietly managed behind the scenes, including Dad's hardware store. For the first few weeks after the funeral, nobody expected much from Dad. Neither Melanie nor I did. He was devastated. Honestly, I was worried about him. One afternoon, about a month after Mom passed, he called me. His voice sounded exhausted. "Can you stop by the store after work?" "Sure. Just for a little while." At the time, that seemed completely reasonable. When I arrived, I found stacks of unopened mail sitting on a desk. Invoices, vendor statements, tax notices, things Mom would normally have handled. Dad looked embarrassed. "I've been trying to get through it." "I know. I just can't focus." I remember sitting down beside him and opening the first envelope, then the second, then the third. What started as helping for one afternoon turned into several evenings that week. Then the following week. Then the week after that. At first, I didn't question it. Dad was grieving. I loved him. Of course I was going to help. Whenever I asked how long he needed me, his answer was always the same. "Just until things settle down." That became his favorite phrase. Just until things settle down. A few weeks later, one of the store's suppliers called me directly. I was surprised they even had my number. The representative sounded nervous. "We haven't received payment." I checked the account. The invoice had somehow been missed. I fixed the issue and moved on. Then another supplier called. Then another. Small problems kept appearing everywhere. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough to keep me constantly involved. One evening, Nathan asked how long I planned to keep helping. I laughed. "Probably another month." He smiled. "That's what you said 3 months ago." At the time, I brushed it off. I genuinely believed things would improve soon. Instead, my involvement kept growing. Employees started calling me when they couldn't reach Dad. Vendors emailed me directly. Questions about payroll somehow landed in my inbox. Without realizing it, I had slowly become the person solving problems. Not the owner, not the manager, the fixer. And everyone seemed relieved that somebody was handling things, including Dad. The strange part was that nobody ever officially asked me to take on that role. It just happened. One problem at a time, one favor at a time, one emergency at a time. I opened my laptop that evening and logged into some old business files. At first, I wasn't looking for anything specific. Maybe I just wanted to remind myself that I wasn't imagining things. Maybe I wanted proof that the last 2 years had actually happened the way I remembered them. I started opening old folders, vendor disputes, payment records, tax documents, email chains. The deeper I looked, the more surprised I became. There were dozens of issues I had completely forgotten about. Problems that had felt urgent at the time. Problems nobody ever mentioned again once they were solved. I kept scrolling, then scrolling some more. An hour passed before I finally leaned back in my chair. Because for the first time, I wasn't looking at individual problems anymore. I was looking at the full picture, and I was starting to realize just how many times that business had nearly fallen apart without anyone ever knowing. I kept digging through those old files. At first, I thought I was just looking through records. What I was actually doing was retracing 2 years of my life, one crisis at a time, one solved problem at a time, one forgotten sacrifice at a time. Some of the emails felt familiar immediately, others I'd completely forgotten. There was a supplier threatening to suspend deliveries because invoices were overdue, a payroll issue that almost delayed employee paychecks, a tax filing mistake that could have triggered penalties. Back then, every situation felt urgent. Now they were just old folders sitting quietly on my laptop. The strange thing was that nobody ever remembered those problems after they were fixed. People only remembered that everything kept running. I found an email chain from nearly 18 months earlier. A supplier had stopped processing new orders. Without inventory, Dad's store would have lost thousands in sales. I remembered spending an entire afternoon on the phone trying to negotiate extra time. 3 separate calls, multiple emails, a lot of promises. Eventually, they agreed. Crisis avoided. At the time, I didn't even tell anyone how close things had come. I simply handled it and moved on. That seemed to be my pattern. Handle it, move on, handle it, move on. Nathan walked into the room while I was scrolling through records. "You've been at that for hours." I rubbed my eyes. "I know." "What are you looking for?" I thought about it, then shrugged. "I don't know anymore." He sat beside me and glanced at the screen. A few minutes later, he pointed at one of the transactions. "Wait, is that your account?" I froze, because I already knew what he was looking at. Several years ago, I had transferred money into the business account to cover an urgent payment. Not a huge amount, but enough to solve a problem. Then I found another transfer, and another. I had completely forgotten some of them. Small emergencies, vendor payments, unexpected expenses, moments when cash flow was tight, and I didn't want employees or suppliers suffering because of it. Nathan looked at me. "Did your dad ever pay you back?" I hesitated. "Some of it." "Some?" I didn't answer. That was answer enough. The more records I reviewed, the more complicated my feelings became. On one hand, I was proud. The business had survived. Employees had kept their jobs. Dad had been able to focus on grieving when he needed to. I genuinely believed helping was the right thing to do. But another part of me kept noticing something uncomfortable. Almost nobody knew. Not really. They saw the business open every morning. They saw bills getting paid. They saw problems disappear. They never saw the person fixing them. A few days later, I stopped by the hardware store after work. One of the employees, Gary, spotted me near the office. "Hey, Olivia." "Hey, you saved us again." I laughed. "What happened now?" "The permit renewal." I blinked. "Oh, right. I'd almost forgotten about that one." Gary shook his head. "Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without you." It was meant as a compliment. A sincere one. But his next sentence stuck with me. "Your dad's lucky you're always on top of everything. Always. Like it was expected. Like it was normal." A few minutes later, another employee thanked me for fixing a payroll issue from months earlier. Then someone else mentioned a vendor dispute I'd resolved. The staff remembered, or at least parts of it. The weird thing was that they all seemed to assume Dad knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't so sure anymore. Dad rarely asked questions. Problems appeared. Then they disappeared. Eventually, that became normal. For him. For everyone. Even for me. That weekend, Melanie invited everyone over for dinner. Nothing special. Just family. Dad was there. The kids were running around. The conversation stayed light at first. School. Sports. Vacation plans. Normal family stuff. Then Melanie started talking about work. One story led to another. Eventually, someone asked how my MBA program was going. Before I could answer, Melanie laughed. "Oh, that's Olivia." She pointed her fork toward me. "Our career sister." A few people chuckled. Dad smiled. Melanie kept going. "Seriously, if Olivia isn't working, studying, or fixing some business problem, I think she'd be completely lost." More laughter. Small laughter. Harmless laughter. The kind that's easy to ignore. I looked around the table. Everyone seemed comfortable. Relaxed. Nobody thought anything was wrong. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether they actually saw me at all, or if they'd gotten so used to what I did that it had simply become part of the background. I tried to laugh along with everyone else at dinner. I really did. But Melanie's little joke kept replaying in my head. Our career sister. The strange thing was that nobody challenged it. Not Dad. Not Melanie's husband. Not even me. The conversation simply moved on, as if that description explained everything about who I was. A few days later, I found myself paying closer attention during family conversations. Not intentionally at first. Just enough to notice things I'd never really noticed before. Melanie called Dad constantly, not about emergencies, not about serious problems, just everyday things. Tyler's baseball practice, Emma's school recital, a parent-teacher conference, a birthday party scheduled 3 weeks away. Small updates, small reminders, small requests. At first, it seemed completely normal. She had kids. Of course she talked about them. But the more I listened, the more I noticed what happened afterward. Dad always adjusted his schedule. Always. One Saturday, he canceled plans to help at the store because Tyler had an extra practice session. Another time, he drove across town to attend a school assembly. A week later, he rearranged an appointment because Melanie needed help watching the kids. None of those things bothered me individually. What bothered me was the pattern. Whenever Melanie needed something, it became urgent. Whenever I needed something, it became flexible. One afternoon, I stopped by the hardware store. Dad was reviewing inventory reports while I fixed an issue with a supplier account. The conversation drifted toward my graduation. It was still a few weeks away at the time. "You'll be there, right?" I asked. Dad looked up. "Of course." The answer came so quickly that I didn't think twice about it. Then his phone rang. "Melanie." He immediately answered. I listened to half the conversation while updating spreadsheets. There was apparently some scheduling conflict involving Tyler's baseball team. By the time the call ended, Dad was already grabbing a notepad. "What day was that game again?" I looked up briefly. Something about the question stuck with me, not because of what he said, because of how quickly his attention shifted. At the time, I ignored the feeling. I wish I hadn't. Around the same period, Melanie started making comments that seemed harmless on the surface. The kind people laugh at. The kind nobody remembers later. Dad would mention not seeing me recently. Melanie would shrug. "Olivia's busy saving the world." Or she'd say, "She probably has another meeting." Or, "You know Olivia. Work comes first." Everyone would smile. The conversation would continue. No argument, no confrontation, just another small comment added to the pile. The weird thing was that none of it was completely false. I was busy. I worked long hours. I was finishing an MBA. I helped manage parts of the store. The comments sounded reasonable because there was always a little truth inside them. But slowly, those comments started becoming people's assumptions. One Sunday afternoon, Dad invited both of us to lunch. Melanie arrived almost 40 minutes late. Nobody seemed bothered. Dad just smiled when she walked in. "Kids keeping you busy?" "You know how it is." Meanwhile, I'd arrived early because Dad had specifically asked me not to be late. Again, nothing major. Just another small thing. But I was starting to collect those moments. The little differences. The double standards. The expectations. The more I noticed them, the harder they became to ignore. That evening, Nathan and I were cleaning up after dinner at home. I was telling him about lunch while loading dishes into the dishwasher. He listened quietly, as usual. When I finished, he dried his hands and leaned against the counter. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He hesitated. Not because he was unsure, because he was choosing his words carefully. Then he asked a question I had never seriously considered before. Do you think your family actually knows everything you've done for them? I stopped moving. The plate in my hand suddenly felt heavier than it should have, because my first instinct was to say yes. Of course they knew. How could they not? But the longer I stood there thinking about it, the less certain I became. And for the first time, I realized I didn't actually know the answer. Do you think your family actually knows everything you've done for them? Nathan's question stayed with me for days. At first, I dismissed it. Of course they knew. Dad knew I helped with the business. Melanie knew I spent time at the store. Everyone knew that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was a difference between knowing I helped and understanding how much I had actually done. Those weren't the same thing. One evening, I opened my laptop and started going through old records again. Only this time, I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for facts, receipts, invoices, bank transfers, vendor emails, anything that showed exactly what had happened over the previous 2 years. Nathan walked into the room carrying coffee. "What are you doing?" I looked up. "Building a case." He laughed. "A case? For my own sanity." That earned a smile from him. I explained what I was thinking. Not an argument, not some dramatic confrontation. I simply wanted one place where everything existed. One place that showed the truth. If anyone ever questioned my involvement, the answer would already be there. Nathan set the coffee down beside me. "Honestly? What? I think that's a good idea." That wasn't the response I expected. "You do?" "Yeah. You've spent years solving problems nobody else sees. Maybe it's time you stopped assuming people know." So I started organizing everything. At first, I thought it would take an hour, maybe 2. I was wrong. The records kept growing. A vendor dispute here, a tax issue there, payment confirmations, emails, financial reports, emergency fixes. Every folder seemed to lead to 3 more folders. The deeper I went, the more complicated the picture became. I bought a large binder during my lunch break, then another one when the first started filling up. Soon, my dining room table looked more like an audit office than a home. Nathan walked past one evening and stopped. "That's a lot." I laughed. "I know." "No, seriously." He picked up one stack. "You did all this?" Apparently I had. The strange thing was that I hadn't realized it while it was happening. When problems arrive one at a time, they don't feel significant. It's only when you see 2 years of them sitting in front of you that the scale becomes obvious. For the first time, I started calculating numbers, hours, payments, outstanding balances, money I'd advanced temporarily. The totals surprised me. Actually, shocked me. Not because I'd been keeping score. I hadn't. That's probably why the number felt so large. I had never stopped to add everything together. One Saturday afternoon, I spent nearly 6 straight hours sorting documents. At one point, Nathan ordered takeout because neither of us felt like cooking. We ate at the dining room table surrounded by stacks of paperwork. "I feel like I'm helping a detective solve a cold case," he joked. I smiled. Honestly, same. But underneath the humor, something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't avoiding the situation. I wasn't making excuses. I wasn't pretending things would somehow fix themselves. I was preparing to have a real conversation, preparing to explain what those 2 years had actually looked like. And for the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful. Not angry, not bitter. Hopeful. Because facts were facts. Surely if Dad saw everything laid out clearly, he would understand. Maybe he hadn't realized how much responsibility had slowly landed on me. Maybe nobody had. The binder kept growing, section after section, month after month. Problem after problem. Then I opened an old bank folder from the first year after Mom died. I almost skipped past it. The file name didn't look important. Just another financial record. But when I opened it, I froze. There, in black and white, was a transfer I'd completely forgotten about. Not a small payment. A large one. Large enough that I immediately remembered the panic I'd felt at the time. The store had been facing a serious cash flow problem. Bills were due. Accounts were behind. And somehow the crisis had disappeared, because I'd used my own savings to cover it. I stared at the screen, then opened another document, and another. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. That entire financial emergency hadn't been solved by the business. It hadn't been solved by Dad. It had been solved by me, and I had the records to prove it. I must have looked through that binder 100 times. Every receipt was in order. Every bank transfer. Every vendor email. Every financial report. Everything was organized so clearly that even Nathan joked he could probably run a board meeting with it. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had something solid to stand on. Not feelings, not assumptions, facts, and facts felt safer. One evening, I spread the documents across the dining room table again. Nathan sat across from me, scrolling through a few pages. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Finally, he looked up. "So what's the plan?" I already knew the answer. "I'm going to show Dad." Nathan nodded slowly. "Okay. I just want him to understand." "And what if he doesn't?" The question caught me off guard. I immediately shook my head. "He will." Nathan didn't argue. He just waited. I continued sorting papers. The longer I talked, the more convinced I became. I don't think he knows how much happened. Maybe. I don't think he remembers half of these situations. That's possible. And if he sees everything together, he'll understand. Nathan rested his elbows on the table. "Maybe." I looked up. "You don't sound convinced." He smiled carefully. "I'm trying to be realistic." That word annoyed me more than it should have. Realistic. I wasn't asking for something impossible. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't demanding praise. I simply wanted acknowledgement. I wanted Dad to understand what those 2 years had actually cost. Nathan noticed my expression. "I'm not saying you're wrong." "Sounds like you are." "No." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm saying facts don't always change people's minds." I immediately disagreed. "This is different." "Why?" "Because he's my father." The answer appeared in my head instantly. I didn't even have to think about it. Because he's my father. Because he loves me. Because once he sees everything, he'll understand. I didn't say all of that out loud, but Nathan could probably read it on my face. He sighed. "I hope you're right." For the next several days, I kept preparing. Not because the binder needed more work. Honestly, it was already finished. I was preparing myself. Sometimes, while driving home from work, I'd imagine how the conversation would go. Dad would flip through the pages. His expression would slowly change. He'd realize how many problems I'd solved, how much money I'd spent, how much time I'd given. Maybe he'd apologize. Maybe he'd thank me. Maybe we'd finally have the conversation we'd avoided for years. Every version ended roughly the same way. Dad understood. The details changed. The outcome didn't. That hope started carrying me through the days. Even the awkward moments felt easier to tolerate. When Melanie made another joke about me being married to my career, I let it go. When Dad canceled a phone call because one of the grandkids needed something, I let it go. Soon, none of it would matter. At least that's what I kept telling myself. A few days before the family dinner, Nathan found me reviewing the binder again. He laughed. "You know every page in there already." "I know." "So why are you reading it again?" I closed the binder. Honestly, I wasn't checking the documents anymore. I was reassuring myself. making sure the conversation would go well, making sure I hadn't imagined everything, making sure I had enough proof. The closer the dinner got, the more nervous I became, not because I expected conflict, because I cared about the outcome, a lot more than I wanted to admit. The night of the dinner finally arrived. Nathan drove while the binder rested on my lap. I probably checked 3 times to make sure I'd brought it. "Relax," he said. "I'm relaxed." He laughed. "No, you're not." Maybe he was right. By the time we arrived, my stomach was in knots. Family members were already gathering inside. Cars lined the driveway. Voices drifted through the open front door. Normal family dinner sounds, the kind we'd had dozens of times before, except this time felt different. I carried the binder inside. Nobody paid much attention to it. Just another thing Olivia brought with her. I took my seat at the dining table and carefully placed it beside my chair. Then I looked around the room. Dad was laughing at something Tyler had said. Melanie was helping set food on the table. Everyone seemed relaxed, comfortable, unaware of the conversation I had spent weeks preparing for. The binder sat quietly beside me while dinner began. Nobody mentioned it. Not Dad, not Melanie, not anyone. At first, I wasn't worried. Family dinners always started the same way. Food first, conversations later. So I waited. I listened. I smiled when appropriate. I told myself there would be a natural opening eventually. There wasn't. The conversation bounced from one topic to another. Tyler's baseball season, Emma's school project, a birthday party coming up next month, a weekend tournament, a teacher everyone liked, then another story about the kids, then another. Every time I thought there might be an opportunity to speak, the discussion shifted somewhere else. At one point, Dad spent 10 straight minutes talking about Tyler's latest game. Everyone seemed genuinely interested. I noticed Nathan glance toward the binder, then toward me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. An hour passed. The binder remained closed. Eventually, Dad looked at me. "So how's work?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I suddenly realized that was the first question anyone had asked me all evening. "It's good." "Still busy?" "Yeah." Melanie smiled. "When is she not busy?" A few people chuckled. I forced a smile. The conversation moved on again. It was strange. I had spent weeks preparing for this dinner. Weeks imagining what I would say. Weeks organizing evidence. And now I was struggling just to find a moment to speak. The longer I sat there, the more awkward it felt. Finally, I decided to stop waiting. "Dad." He looked over. "Yeah?" I hesitated for half a second, then said it. "I was actually a little hurt about graduation." The room didn't go silent dramatically. Nobody gasped. Nobody looked shocked. The reaction was much smaller than that, which somehow made it worse. Melanie immediately answered before Dad did. "Olivia." Her tone sounded patient, like she was explaining something obvious. "Tyler only gets so many games." I looked at her. "I know." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I thought you understood." There it was again. That word. Understood. As if the problem wasn't what happened. The problem was my reaction to it. I looked at Dad. "I'm trying to." Melanie shook her head. "You need to be more understanding." The response came so quickly that it felt rehearsed. Not cruel. Not angry. Just automatic. Like this wasn't even a debate. I sat there for a moment, waiting for someone else to say something. Nathan stayed quiet. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. Nobody disagreed with Melanie. Nobody asked why I felt hurt. Nobody asked what graduation meant to me. Nobody seemed curious at all. The conversation simply continued. Almost immediately, within minutes, everyone was talking about schedules and sports again, as if nothing important had happened. I looked down at the binder beside my chair. Weeks of preparation, hundreds of pages, receipts, emails, bank records, proof. So much proof. For the first time, a thought crossed my mind that hadn't occurred to me before. What if the issue wasn't that they didn't know? What if they simply didn't want to know? I looked around the table. Dad was listening to another story from Melanie. The kids were laughing. Everyone seemed comfortable. Nobody appeared interested in hearing anything that might disrupt the version of the family they were already happy with. And suddenly, I understood something. Not completely, but enough. The binder had never really been about numbers. It had been about recognition, about finally being seen, about finally being understood. I had convinced myself that evidence would create that understanding. But sitting there at that table, I wasn't so sure anymore. My hand rested on the binder. For several seconds, I just stared at it. Then I quietly slid it closer. Not to open it, to do the opposite. I closed the cover completely and pushed it away from me. For the first time since I started putting it together, I decided I wasn't going to show anyone what was inside. The drive home was quiet. Not the angry kind of quiet. Not the kind where someone is waiting to start an argument. Just quiet. Nathan kept both hands on the steering wheel and let me sit with my thoughts. I appreciated that. There wasn't much to say anyway. The binder sat in the back seat. Closed. Untouched. Exactly the way it had been all evening. At one red light, Nathan glanced over. "You okay?" I stared out the window. "Yeah." He gave me a look. The same look he had been giving me for years whenever I wasn't being honest. I managed a small smile. Maybe not. He nodded. That was enough. The thing that bothered me wasn't that nobody agreed with me. It was that nobody seemed interested in understanding me. There was a difference. A big one. For weeks, I'd convinced myself that the family dinner would finally clear everything up. That once people saw the facts, things would make sense. Instead, I walked away feeling strangely empty, not angry, just tired. A different kind of tired than the one that comes from work or school. The kind that comes from carrying expectations for too long. A few days later, I stopped by the hardware store. Dad was meeting with a supplier, so I headed toward the small office in the back. Mom's old office. The room hadn't changed much since she passed away. Dad mostly used it for storage now. Old folders, unused equipment, boxes nobody wanted to deal with. I started cleaning simply because it gave me something to do. One box became two. Two became four. For a while, I focused on organizing paperwork and throwing away things that clearly weren't needed anymore. It felt surprisingly peaceful. Then I found a small greeting card tucked between several old files. At first, I almost threw it away. The envelope was unmarked. No date, no name, just a folded card. I opened it out of curiosity. The handwriting stopped me immediately. Mom's. I would have recognized it anywhere. For a moment, I just stood there staring. Then I sat down in her old chair and started reading. The card wasn't long. It looked like something she'd written years earlier. Maybe for herself. Maybe for someone else. I honestly had no idea. But one sentence seemed to jump off the page. Your value is not determined by who celebrates you. Your value is determined by who you are when nobody is watching. I read it again, and then a fourth time. The room felt strangely still. Not dramatic, not magical, just quiet. The kind of quiet that lets something finally sink in. For months, maybe years, I had been chasing recognition without admitting it. Not money, not praise. Recognition. I wanted Dad to see me. I wanted my family to understand what I'd done. I wanted proof that my sacrifices mattered. And suddenly, I was sitting in Mom's old office holding a card that seemed to challenge all of that. I leaned back in the chair. For the first time since graduation, I stopped replaying old conversations in my head. Stopped imagining better responses. Stopped planning future explanations. The strange part was that nothing had actually changed. Dad was still Dad. Melanie was still Melanie. The family dynamics were exactly the same. Yet something inside me felt lighter. Not healed, not fixed, just lighter. When I got home that evening, Nathan noticed immediately. "You seem different." I laughed softly. "Do I?" "A little." I handed him the card. He read it quietly, then looked at me. "Your mom was smart." "Yeah. Sounds like something you needed to hear." I folded the card carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. For once, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself, or explain myself, or prove anything. That night, the binder stayed exactly where it was. Closed. I didn't open it once. The next morning, I woke up knowing there was something I needed to do, a decision that would have felt impossible just a few months earlier. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of making it. I woke up before my alarm. Not because I had somewhere important to be, because I'd already made up my mind. The decision felt strange, simple, but strange. For nearly 2 years, checking on the hardware store had become part of my daily routine, before work, during lunch, after dinner, sometimes before bed. There was always something, an invoice, a vendor question, a payroll issue, a permit renewal, a supplier problem. I had convinced myself that if I stopped paying attention, everything would fall apart. Now, I wasn't so sure. I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee and opened the final version of the operational guide I'd been working on. If I was stepping back, I wanted to do it responsibly. Not emotionally, not impulsively, responsibly. So I spent several days organizing everything. Passwords, vendor contacts, payment schedules, tax deadlines, software instructions, account information, step-by-step procedures. Every process I had been carrying around in my head. I wrote it all down. The document eventually became thicker than I expected. Nathan glanced at it one evening. "That's basically an owner's manual." I laughed. "Pretty much." "You realize most people wouldn't do this?" "Maybe." But I wasn't trying to punish anyone. That was the difference. I wasn't walking away because I wanted the business to struggle. I was walking away because it wasn't actually my business. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that. The following week, I met Dad at the store. The binder of instructions sat between us in the office. He looked surprised. "What's all this?" "A guide." "A guide?" I nodded. "For bookkeeping, vendors, reporting, operations, everything I've been handling." Dad flipped through several pages. His eyebrows rose slightly. "This is detailed." "That's the point." He looked up. "Why are you giving me this?" I took a breath. "Because this conversation mattered. I need to step back." Dad stared at me. "What do you mean?" "I'll still help occasionally if there's an emergency." I chose my words carefully. "But I can't keep managing everything behind the scenes." The room became quiet. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. Dad slowly closed the binder. "I didn't realize you felt that way." Part of me wanted to say a lot more. About graduation, about the family dinner, about the last 2 years. Instead, I simply nodded. Yeah, that was enough. At least for now. To my surprise, he didn't argue. Maybe because the guide made the situation feel practical instead of emotional. Maybe because he genuinely believed everything would be fine. Honestly, I wasn't sure. What I did know was that I walked out of the store feeling lighter and guilty. Both at the same time. The guilt lasted about 3 days. Then reality started showing up. A vendor emailed Dad instead of me. An invoice was processed late. An employee called with a question that normally would have come straight to my phone. The issues weren't disasters, just small cracks. the kind I'd spent years patching before anyone noticed. Dad called one afternoon. "Do you remember which account handles the monthly supplier reconciliation?" I smiled. "It's in section 4. There was a pause. "You numbered the sections?" "Of course I did." He laughed. For the first time in a while, the conversation felt normal, not because I solved the problem, because I didn't. I simply pointed him toward the instructions. The responsibility stayed where it belonged. That feeling was surprisingly satisfying. A few more small issues appeared over the next several days, nothing catastrophic. Just enough to remind me how much invisible work had always existed. For once, I didn't rush in to fix everything. I let people handle their own responsibilities, including Dad. Nathan noticed the difference. "You seem calmer." "I think I am." "How does that feel?" I thought about it. "Unfamiliar." He laughed. That was probably the most accurate answer I could have given. One afternoon, I arrived home from work and found an envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. No return address I recognized. Just my name, written neatly across the front. I picked it up and turned it over. Nathan looked up from the living room. "That came earlier. Any idea what it is?" He shrugged. "No clue." I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was an invitation. I read the first line, then read it again, because it was the last thing I expected to receive. Someone was organizing a graduation celebration. For me. I honestly thought maybe 20 people would show up. That felt generous. The invitation had come from one of my professors, and I assumed it would be a small graduation dinner, a few classmates, a couple coworkers, nothing more. Instead, Nathan and I walked into a community center filled with people. I stopped in the doorway. There were over 100 people there, professors, former clients, co-workers, friends, people from volunteer projects, people I hadn't seen in years. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring. Nathan leaned closer. "You okay?" I laughed nervously. "I think so." One by one, people came over to talk. A former coworker reminded me how I'd helped her study for a certification exam after work. One of my professors talked about how I always made time for struggling classmates. A former client told a story about a business crisis I'd helped solve when everyone else stopped answering his calls. Some stories I remembered. Some I honestly didn't. That was the strange part. The things I thought were small had mattered to other people. By the end of the evening, I was emotionally exhausted. But for the first time in a long time, it wasn't from trying to prove myself. It was from realizing I didn't have to. Outside in the parking lot, Nathan and I sat on a bench before driving home. The sun was setting. People were still leaving the building behind us. I looked at him and shook my head. "I don't know what to do with all this." Nathan smiled. "You don't have to do anything." "What do you mean?" "They came because they wanted to be here." Simple answer, but it stayed with me. Nobody had attended because they felt obligated. Nobody had been pressured. They came because somewhere along the way our lives had crossed, and it mattered to them. That realization felt different from the approval I'd been chasing from my family. It felt quieter, more solid. The following months brought changes I hadn't expected. The hardware store didn't collapse, but problems started appearing. Vendor issues, accounting questions, missed deadlines. Small things that used to get solved before anyone even noticed. Dad began calling more often, not to hand problems to me, to ask questions. Sometimes I'd direct him to the instruction guide I'd left behind. Sometimes he'd figure it out himself. For the first time, the responsibility stayed where it belonged. One afternoon, he asked me to have lunch with him. Just lunch. No emergency. No business problem. Just the two of us. The conversation started awkwardly. Then Dad looked down at his coffee and said quietly, "I didn't realize how much you were doing." I didn't respond right away. he continued. Things keep coming up. Stuff I never even knew existed. A small laugh escaped him. Not a happy one. Then he looked at me. I should have paid more attention. I nodded. So should I. A few seconds passed. Then he added something I never thought I'd hear. I'm sorry I missed your graduation. The apology wasn't perfect. It didn't erase anything. But it was real. And for once, that mattered more than getting the exact words I'd imagined. Melanie never had some dramatic downfall. Life rarely works that way. But as practical problems became harder to ignore, her version of events stopped carrying the same weight. People started seeing things for themselves. I didn't have to argue. I didn't have to present evidence. Reality handled that part. Months later, I found myself reading Mom's handwritten note again. The same note I had discovered in her old office. I realized something that surprised me. My family finally started seeing me clearly only after I stopped trying so hard to make them see me. By then, I was focused on my own future, my own work, my own life, and somehow that changed everything. Not because everyone suddenly became perfect. They didn't. Not because every wound disappeared. Some didn't. But I no longer measured my value by who showed up for me. And that made all the difference. If you've ever spent years carrying responsibilities nobody noticed, or sacrificing for people who took it for granted, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my position? Feel free to share your experience in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for listening. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.